Hi everyone, this is Avery Jamerson, co-director of TU Media Lab Studio 151, an undergraduate in history and psychology, a student here at the University of Tulsa. Today I have a very special guest, Dr. Arnold, the current chair of the history department here at TU, and associate professor of ancient and medieval history and director of classical studies. So, Dr. Arnold, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your areas of expertise and interest?
Yeah, sure. My area of expertise is the late Roman Empire and the early Middle Ages. And I like to say I work on barbarians. And of course, this is a podcast, so you can't see what I look like. But I'll just explain. I'm heavily bearded. My hair is a mess. And I generally don't care what I look like. So I am a walking barbarian. But yeah, I work on the fall of Rome. I work on barbarians. I work on late Latin literature. I work on issues of identity, issues of gender, sort of shifts in conceptions of Romanness, things like that, in a very tumultuous time when things were rapidly changing in the greater kind of Mediterranean world. That's my research.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, it's very nice to have you here. Thank you for your time. And in anticipation of the election next week, this special episode will cover the origins of democracy in respect to Greek and Roman political traditions. And so first, I kind of wanted to discuss that I think there's this general assumption with a lot of people when it comes to democracy and its origins. People really focus on ancient Greece, or like Athens in particular, and the emergence of its democratic principles in the 5th, 6th century BCE.
Mm-hmm.
So with that in mind, I'm kind of curious on why you think people tend to recall the polis in Athens rather than the Roman Republic, which we'll talk more about is more aligned with U.S. principles.
Yeah. I think one reason is because the actual word democracy is derived from a Greek word, demokratia, which basically means rule of the demos or demos, which means rule of the people, sort of broadly. And so because the sort of etymology of the word democracy is Greek in origin, it already kind of brings to mind this concept of democracy. When we think of Rome, we often think of the sort of evil Roman Empire that you encounter in sort of movies or perhaps in the New Testament, crucifying Jesus and things like that. And so Rome is often associated with autocracy and things like that. But the reality is the Roman Republic was a really interesting mixture of all sorts of different government types, including democratic elements. And when the founding fathers actually, were thinking about the American Republic, that's what they called it, they were thinking about the Roman Republic. So on the one hand, there's this sort of word, democracy, and on the other hand, there's the reality of what the founders had in mind, and they definitely weren't thinking about Greece. They would have looked at ancient Greece and thought, wow, that's mob rule. That's not good. And the American Republic was explicitly designed to exclude the mob, and to kind of hopefully keep down demagoguery. There's great danger theoretically in democracy, right? Because when majority rules, if the majority is wrong, then that's a problem. And this is something that ancient Greek political philosophers debated, right? What's the best government? And some actually concluded it's monarchy as long as you have an enlightened monarch, because then you don't have to worry about bad decisions. You have one person, there's no debate, and every time the decision that's made is the right decision. Whereas with democracy, the people can be sort of swayed in the wrong direction, and then atrocities can happen. And we've seen that in the 20th century.
Yeah, mob rule's an issue, but then at the same time, we're kind of seeing the effect of not being involved. It's just being very, misinformed.
Yeah. If you read Thucydides, and yeah, don't do that, by the way, he's very boring. But if you read Thucydides, he comments actually, and he's an aristocrat, so he has he looks down his nose at the people. But the reality of these sort of ancient Greek sources is that the vast majority of them really aren't in favor of democracy. So we have this sort of aristocratic bias, and the aristocratic bias is one that suggests that the people are easily led astray, that they can be hoodwinked, that any kind of demagogue who speaks well or has, slogans that ring a bell or that appeal to kind of baser instincts will get what they want because the people are dumb.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, we have this idea that like, okay, in democracy, they're enlightened and all of this, but in the reality is these are normal people, just like Americans, and there's quite the spectrum of sort of ignorance and lack of ignorance. And so this and so like if you look, for instance, at Athens, it's mob rule, for instance, that leads to the condemnation of Socrates. It's fear of mob rule that leads to Xenophon leaving. It's fear of mob rule that leads Aristotle to leave Athens. I mean, we have lots of individuals who basically don't feel like democracy is in their best interest, and so they leave.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, are you good to move on to a conversation about Rome?
Yeah,
now?
sure.
Okay, cool. You've mentioned that a lot of the Roman Republic and their ideals and principles, is what inspired the founding fathers. So, were they looking at a certain period of Rome for inspiration, or just kind of the general system?
They were looking at the entire thing,
Mm-hmm.
and they were mostly reading Livy as sort of their source. Livy and some of Cicero. These were their main sort of authors that they were interested in. But what they liked about the early and middle Republic were the virtues of these sort of founders of the Roman Republic, their sort of dedication to this idea of libertas, liberty, right? It's very important to the Romans. This idea of liberty, this idea of sort of different aspects of society working together, and especially an idea of service to the greater good and especially to the state. So, one of the models to come out of sort of Livy is Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus was essentially called up from his farm in an emergency. He was appointed dictator, which is like temporary king, but it's temporary. And as soon as the emergency was over, he went back to farming. And, if that reminds you of anybody from American history, it should, because George Washington was commonly called Cincinnatus in his own day, right? He was called up, he served, he went back to his farm. He served as president. When he was done, he retired. After his 2 terms, he had no interest in serving 3. He set that precedent. And so they really were looking to that. But they were also looking to the late Republic because it failed. And so they were very, aware of the sort of reasons why, or concerned about the reasons why the Roman Republic collapsed. And one of the reasons the Roman Republic collapsed was the rise of sort of military dictators. Well, actually, they were technically dictators, but military dictators, like in the modern sense of the word, rather than Roman. So that was one issue, which is, I think, one of the reasons why the founders weren't interested in having a standing army.
Yeah.
Right. The other thing that they were concerned about was factionalism and political parties. So that's something that George Washington was like, no parties. But, we don't want parties. He wasn't part of a party, and he was, I think, the only president in American history who was uncontested, right? Because there weren't parties. But as soon as Washington was out, we had parties. The Romans didn't have parties in the same way that we do, named parties, but they did actually have sort of this break between those who favored the aristocrats and those who favored the sort of mob, right, the people.
Yeah.
Those who favored the elite were called optimates, which basically means aristocrats, or those who favor the best.
Okay.
And the others were called populares, which means those who favor the people, right, the popularists. I go to a dinner and I'm introduced as a Roman historian to some stranger. And then they inevitably ask me, so is United States Rome? And my answer is always, it depends on which Rome you're asking. Well, it's even worse because in Rome, it's not even execution with a trial. There's a mob that forms and an individual is dragged through the streets. Well, I mean, my feeling about impeachment at this point is that it's become entirely politicized and it's more or less meaningless. Supreme Court ruling that anything a president does while in office for the sake of the office, they can't, they're not accountable for it.